Good morning. This is Gloria Ladson-Billings from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Dr. Ladson-Billings, thank you so much for being here. Wanted to begin by asking you, could you begin by sharing some of the ways in which culture importantly shows up in your work as an educational researcher?
Well, culture is actually the central concept of my work, and it's probably because my training is in anthropology. You can't really talk about anthropology without talking about culture. So culture, which was typically not a part of, say, teacher education or educational preparation, has become really central to the way in which I think about my work. If you look at the way we prepare teachers, we focus on educational psychology, sociology, perhaps history or philosophy, all social sciences that are all worthy, but they don't focus as much on culture. And so adding anthropology and adding culture to our work, I think, rounds it out, gives it more dimension, and helps us understand actually what's happening to students.
Wonderful. Could you please elaborate on this as this closely relates to Korea's focus on assessment and evaluation?
So if we've left culture out of teaching, we've left it out of learning, it probably makes sense that we've left it out of assessment. Finally, we're getting to a place where we understand culture is central to teaching and learning, but I'm not sure we've gotten to that place yet with assessment. Our sense of assessment is that it is typically sort of straightforward. You ask questions, you find out what students know, you assess teachers, you look at what they know, but we have not thought about the underlying cultural underpinnings of the whole process. I like to think about the way in which we do, I'll call it assessing, for driver's tests. It's a very culturally bounded system because those young people who take that test, most of them can't drive, but they can pass the test. And so the ritual of taking the test is sort of a cultural system. We know when they leave DMV, they can't drive. But we also know that they will learn to drive in the process of driving, that the more hours and experience they get. But the culture has agreed, if they, quote, pass this particular test, we'll say they can drive. We haven't gotten that far with assessment in a classroom or assessment of teachers.
Beautifully said, thank you. Could you now please describe the meanings or dimensions of culture that are most central to your own work? And can you please share an example of this?
Well, I actually think my work is evolving, and I think that's the wonderful thing about cultures. Cultures are dynamic. Anytime you think that you know everything there is about a culture and there's no more to learn, then you're talking about a culture that is about to die. Because cultures are changing and evolving and all the time. So, for example, we have a lot of Southeast Asian immigrants in my state of Wisconsin. Well, the generation that is in school today is very different from their parents' generation. That was a generation that may have been in transition. And that's very different from their grandparents' generation, which is a generation that grew up in Laos and parts of China. So culture is always changing, and I think my work is changing also. The parts of culture that have been really central to my work have been things like language, the arts, family structure, child rearing practices, because all of those things intersect with schools. The ways in which my work is changing, however, is the way in which youth culture is becoming much more of a force for young people. So I spend my time reading all kinds of things about the development of hip-hop, the use of hip-hop, and I've run now 2 hip-hop classes on the way in which this youth culture, things like spoken word, the art, the graffiti, really are ways in which young people are making meaning. And if we are going to be successful with these young people, we have to know about this. It doesn't mean we turn into hip-hop heads. It means we at least acknowledge its salience in their life and understand what it is that they're all about.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. The core mission of CREA is to generate evidence for policy making that is not only methodologically but also culturally and contextually defensible. So can you please describe the ways in which your current work connects to CREA's mission?
Well, Dr. Hood and I have been having this conversation for a very long time, at least 10 years, where we're trying to figure out how do we begin to build assessments, evaluations, rubrics that take into account culture. Now the problem is you're always in a culture. You can never step outside of a culture. So we don't have the benefit of being able to isolate particular elements, but we have to look in a more composite way. So I think the big challenge for CREA is how do we create a more robust, more multifaceted approach to assessment. And it may mean that we won't have a one-size-fits-all. It may mean that there will be elements of the assessment that are more germane to some aspects of culture and less relevant to other aspects of culture. So then we get into issues of scoring and evaluating and deciding which of these things are the most essential pieces to have in place.
Mm-hmm. How do you see your future work interfacing with CREA and connecting to its mission, if you want to expand?
Well, if I ever find that document that Dr. Hood has been chasing me about, and I still can't find it, we'll begin to look at the way in which at one point in my early study I actually did come up with some assessment questions. Never intended to publish it, which is why I can't seem to find it. But for my own sense of well-being, I wanted to be able to benchmark the qualities that I've seen among these teachers off of a Likert type scale where they actually rated themselves. So maybe, just maybe, I will be able to reconstruct that work, and it might be useful at CREA.
Wonderful. And the next question is, what are your goals for participating in the CREA conference as a panelist?
Well, I think my big challenge as the sort of morning speaker was to get us going, to lay out some broad questions. I think the point I made about assessment being a very long tradition in American schools, going back to the mid-1800s, is kind of an important way for us to think about it. We often think, oh, we're doing something new. Not really. We're doing the same old things, and unfortunately we're not doing them much better than we did them centuries ago. So in some ways it's kind of to lay out the landscape, to just begin to raise the questions that people want to be able to engage in.
Beautiful. What do you hope your audience learned from your talk this morning?
First of all, I hope people understand the historical, the long haul. We get very frustrated. It is actually very much an element of American culture to want to do things quickly. Why don't we have this done? Why did this happen? Why didn't this happen? I've been very intrigued by this presidential administration and how quickly people want things to happen. I mean, healthcare was over a 40-year process, and it's like, oh, well, he's not getting this done, So I wanted people to understand that assessment has been an issue that we've been grappling with for a long time. I also wanted them to understand that even when we think we have, quote, better assessments, there are some equity dangers that we have to consider. I don't think we'll ever get, quote, that perfect assessment system, but I think we can fine-tune and get better. And so I hope that the conversation throughout the conference is about how do we get better. Let's not, in many ways in the society, we have bifurcated into warring camps. You're either for it or against it, and I actually do think there's a middle ground. I think there's a place for assessment, but I also think that we cannot be so strident and just limited to say that the only way we can assess things like teachers would be to look at student test scores. We can't have those all or nothing approaches. We do have to have a more robust, more multifaceted approach to assessment so that we get a better idea.
Beautiful. How do you see these schools serving the mission of Korea?
These schools?
The goals.
These goals.
What do you just
sorry, I
said?
thought you said schools. Sorry.
No.
Well, I think, Korea is really trying to do something new and different. And whenever you try to do something new and different, you're taking a risk because we are very much creatures of habit. Yeah, even as educational researchers, we do replication, we do the same thing, or we might tweak something ever so slightly. So I think the idea that Korea is trying to move in a new direction, the kinds of questions that I've tried to raise along with my co-panelists are important ones in the thinking. A cultural feature of American society is doing, not thinking. We like to do. And so in some ways, Korea is pushing the thinking side. So whether or not we get a lot of products out quickly, have a lot of answers quickly, to me is not essential. It's much better to have really good thinking up front. You can produce something on the other end as long as you have the right, good thinking, good conceptual and theoretical groundwork laid on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hard to create an instrument. It's hard to create the thinking that undergirds an instrument. I've been on way too many dissertations where the methodology has been absolutely elegant, hierarchical linear modeling, path analysis. This is beautiful, but I've sat there and said, but this is a stupid question, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we got to make sure we're asking good questions and doing hard and deep thinking conceptually about how we might go about answering those questions. If we can do all of that, what I call front loading, we're going to have little or no trouble creating instruments.
Thank you. How do you see these schools serving the broader mission or vision of cultural competence and responsiveness in education, or perhaps more broadly in research or evaluation? And you did allude to that, but if you want to explain.
Right, and I think, the whole notion of cultural competence, we're talking about a moving target because the culture is changing. The culture that my grandchildren are a part of is different than the culture that I grew up in. And so because culture is so dynamic, because things are changing so rapidly, because the technologies are bringing us closer together and our kids are more engaged in global cultures, because of increased immigration, because the geopolitical boundaries don't mean the same thing that they meant a generation or two ago. I think it's really hard to put something fixed in place, and so Korea is going to have to become nimble, flexible, being able to in some ways change on a dime, which is why that point I made about the thinking up front, the conceptual and the theoretical groundwork will be the saving grace.
Thank you. And finally, what vision, aspirations, or tactics do you have for Korea?
Well, my dream would be that in some ways Korea becomes a go-to entity for school districts that are struggling to talk about the work of teachers. Right now, given things like value added, and I don't want to come off as saying I'm, quote, against value added, but the value added colleagues that I know themselves know what their shortcomings are. They know that school districts don't want to look at 3 to 5 years of data. They want to know at the end of May, is this a good teacher?
Mm-hmm.
My dream is that CREA will become this place where school districts, school board members, superintendents would say, let's talk to the folks at CREA to see what they can tell us about how our teachers are doing. Let's talk to these folks about how we might have more dynamic and multifaceted assessments, not just of our teachers, but of our students, and that we don't become so reliant on testing services to produce paper and pencil tests, that we have better and more expansive ways to think about it. This is probably a really weird example, but at the end of a football season, those seniors who are hopeful of going into the draft participate in something called the combine. That is, they run, they jump, they do a variety of things to demonstrate what they are able to do. That's different from watching them in real time in a football game. The scouts, the coaches, the front office people have to make some decision based on the real-time performance of these young men as well as these measured, isolated skills. It's not either or, it's both and. So while, as I said, it's kind of a crude example, it's a much more authentic way in which they think about, is this person going to be an outstanding football player? And they ask the question, are they going to fit into our system and the way in which we run our program? So you could have somebody who's incredibly good at something, but a team might say, but because we run this particular defense, he's not going to work out well with us. So having that kind of flexibility and ways to look in a lot of different directions is something that I hope that CREA will be able to do.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's a beautiful illustration.
Alrighty. Yeah, the football combine, right?